to the Flying Fish podcast. My name is Helen McMenamin, and this is the first podcast in the Navigating Grief After Loss series. And today I will be taking a look about what does grief feel like. So I'm very much talking from my own experience here. I do have a personal background of overcoming suicide. When I was 24, my husband took his own life, which was quite shocking and unexpected. And I was quite young when it happened. And in my professional life, I've worked with adults with mental health and other difficulties. Most of my adult life, working life anyway. So let's start at the beginning. So my grief story started really when I was 24 years old. I had recently been married. I had been promoted at work. I was doing very well, me and my husband were. And he'd been promoted to be a manager of a store. We were both young. We had our own property and life seemed to be going great until one morning I woke up and my husband was missing. I realised as I was leaving the house, it wasn't unusual for him not to be there because he would usually leave the house before me to go to work. And it was when I left the house that I realised that there was something wrong. My car was gone from out the front of my house. And I ran back in, I rang my husband, trying to work out why the car wasn't there. And his phone rang on the windowsill, which was it was a moment where I just knew something wasn't right and all the shop keys were there. Anyway, the day unfolded where my husband was found and it became very apparent that he had took his own life. And I just really want to talk about what it's like to experience something like that. First of all, I want to say it's a very, very disorientating experience. Our world looks the same, everything looks the same, but it doesn't feel the same. It's tainted. It's a very, very disorientating time, and I just found it really hard to come to terms with what had happened because it was so shocking, and to work a way through living again when at that point, when it very first happened with the months around it, this new world feels so strange and unkind. It was a very, very challenging time. Because my husband's death was so sudden, often suicides are, it took me months to actually process what had happened. I was in shock for months. I didn't want to watch the TV. I didn't want the radio on. That was too much real life for me, that it was too much to bear. So I lived in a bit of a bubble, and I kind of demanded that from my friends as well, that they didn't put the TV on when they came around and they didn't put the radio on, which I realise now sounds silly. And I didn't really understand what it was about at the time. I just knew I couldn't bear it. It was like alarm bells going off in my head. And it was shock. It was a protective bubble. I didn't really feel like it was my life. I felt like I'd been picked up out of my life and plunked into another life. And I just kind of had to get on with it. So it wasn't until I tried to return to work that the absolute gravity of what had happened really, really hit me, and it really hit me hard. And it was, like I say, it was the act of returning to work. I'd kind of tried to muddle through a bit of a day, very disorientated, you don't really know. I didn't really know what I felt like, what I wanted out of my life. And I was driving home from work and I just started to feel all these horrible feelings inside. And I just thought, what's that? What are these feelings? And then I thought, this is reality. This is the reality of my husband being gone, and he's not going to be there when I get in. And that really hurt, and it hit really, really hard. And this was months after he had died. So that's hard for people to understand who are around you, because often those friends have come to terms, and some of them, they don't like what's happened, but they've come to terms with it. They've come to accept it. And then I was then starting to go through the grieving process. And by then, like I said, people had got their head around what had happened, and they'd got used to it. And I just hadn't at all. It was a very hard time. I was desperately sad, feeling very isolated. It was a difficult time. It's a real physical and mental pain. There are actual physical pains in the chest, in the heart area, where in the gut area, where you're actually physically feeling pain. It's not just a psychological thing. That psychological aspect, it affects the body as well. There was a lot of strange things kind of going around in my head at the time. I was frightened to sleep because I didn't want to have to remember when I woke up where my life was. I didn't want to have to go through that grieving process again. So I didn't sleep. And there's a lot of emotions that happen around grief, and I'm going to read some of them out after. But there was a real fear, and I've never really heard anybody talk to me about the fear that often accompanies grief. For me, with the loss of a spouse, there was an absolute fear. I was a bit spiritual, and I have to say I felt very deserted spiritually. In fact, I'd never felt so deserted. And I was quite creeped out at the thought of my husband, this is going to sound silly, but of my husband being in spirit and then wanting to make contact with me. And it wasn't that I didn't want to speak to him, but I was frightened that something might try and take advantage of us. There was a fear. There was a fear about being on my own, and I don't mean that in a sense of, it was actually just being in the house on my own. It creeped me out, and I wasn't really expecting that I felt quite afraid in the house on my own. When people take their own lives, which we will go into detail later, on another podcast, I'll go into the subject on its own, but it can bring a lot of feelings of shock, and there's this question of why did they do it? Why did my loved one take their own life? Why did I not know that was happening? Why did he not speak to somebody else about it? Why did nobody see? Why could I not see? I was actually training to be a counsellor at the time, so that was a bit of I just couldn't understand why he didn't feel like he could talk to me when I was actually training in that area. And it makes you question who they actually were as well. Because for me, for my husband, I didn't think that he was capable of that. I didn't think that I didn't even realise he was depressed. He kept his cards very close to his chest, and I had absolutely no idea that that's what he'd been planning. And it was planned what happened. It wasn't a spur of the moment thing. It was planned. Um, so that it then taints, or can for me, it tainted our relationship because I thought, I don't actually know this person. This person who is able to do this, who are they? And for me, I got stuck on why and what made you think that was a good idea. And that I was just stuck in that loop for a very, very long time. I was very lucky in that I was actually part of a big friendship group when it happened. Me and my husband were, and within a year, most of those friends had gone. For whatever reason, I think it was, I take responsibility for that, in that my grief wasn't necessarily other people's problem. And also grief, going through that level of desertion and fear and not knowing, being disorientated, it's taxing on friendships. And I possibly wasn't the best person to be around. I possibly, I just wasn't the best person to be around. And that was evident by how many friends I lost in such a short space of time. I was very lucky that my husband's family were very close. They lived down south, and I was able to visit them, and it was like a bolt hole. It was somewhere I could run to get away from reality to a certain degree, but not totally escape, because I was with my husband's mother and family, and they were grieving, but it felt like we had that in common. So it was a safe place to be. Um, when I lost my husband, something that did happen with my friendships was that I struggled to be around people who hadn't I didn't ex I didn't perceive as having experienced trauma. I felt alienated by people who I didn't. We were only young, we were 24 years old, and fortunately, a lot of people haven't experienced too much trauma by that age. And it made me feel like an alien. I felt like these people can't understand what I'm going through. And it did. I felt more relaxed and more able to relate to people who had experienced trauma. So that was possibly another element of my relationships that was affected by the loss of my husband. Um, it's there was also so the relationships were strained, and I didn't know who I was anymore. I'd been with this person for 4.5 years, and we'd bought a house together. We'd sorted our house out together. We'd been on holidays. We'd purchased a car. And these were things that we'd done as a collaboration, as a couple. And now I was on my own, and it was like an identity crisis. I didn't know who I was anymore. I didn't know what I liked, didn't know what I didn't like, because I had kind of surrendered so much of that into a partnership, and I didn't I didn't know what I wanted to do anymore, and it's hard because I was a young person living on my own. But then there was benefits to that as well, and for me, those benefits were being able to travel. So within a year, certainly, of my husband dying, I got the travel bug and started traveling all over the world, backpacking, traveling on trains, um, just going all over the place. And that was a real tonic for me because when you travel on your own, nobody knows why you're there. Nobody knows your backstory. They only know what you want to tell them. And I found that grounding. I found that, and it was an escape as well. I was in beautiful places, waking up to glorious sunrises, scorching heat, beautiful scenery, and it was a great way for me to spend that time because I just being at home was too much of a reminder all the time about what had happened and that he wasn't coming home anymore. And being away, I still had that loss and I still missed him, but everything's different. And yeah, that's what helped me. I think when we go through grief, there's a big cognitive event going on, and our brains are trying desperately to make sense of what's happened and why. And is there anything I can learn from this? Is there anything I could have done differently? And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who was a psychiatrist, and she was a pioneer in the study of death and dying, and she gave us our understanding of the 5 stages of grieving, which is denial, bargaining, shock, sadness. There is one more as well. I'll find it. And it's not hard and fast. But it's a guide. It's something to push against or to test out, and it's a framework to understand some of the emotions that happen when we do lose a loved one. And for me, particularly, losing a loved one suddenly is very, very shocking, and that in itself is difficult to cope with. Somebody being there one minute and then not the next, and that takes time to process. And I'm not saying it makes it any easier in the long run, because I've had other people say, well, I knew my loved one was dying, but we couldn't talk about it. They wouldn't talk, and that it didn't help. But there's something about being able to anticipate grief. It doesn't take the pain away. It doesn't take the sting away. But it's the shock. The shock is so disorientating. It's really disorientating. And people say things to me, because I did used to host a peer-to-peer support group for people who had lost loved ones, not just to suicide in general. And people would say, how long will this take? And grief it's a journey. It's not the destination. Grief is learning to live and come to terms with the fact that our loved one isn't around anymore. And it's important that as many resources as possible can be used to help you to process that. And at the time, I just had his family really to process his grief with, or my grief with, for him. And now that there are support groups around suicide and around grief, and they're quite casual, they're not necessarily formal affairs, You can just kind of drop in, and these places, I just know I would have loved it because I didn't meet anybody who had lost somebody to suicide. There was an incident when I was a child growing up. A neighbour took their own lives, and that was shocking and hard to get my head around. But I was a child, and as an adult, there wasn't really anybody to talk to who could understand exactly what you're going through, because suicide for me personally, it's 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 as shocking as a murder, and in some way to those left behind, it's hard because it's actually a loved one that's done it. So suicide are avoidable deaths. These are avoidable, and that's what makes it so hard to come to terms with, because what if I'd woke up early that morning? What if someone had got there in time to stop him? What if I'd realised before and I'd managed to get him help? And all these things are just perpetually running round and round in your head. And they're hard to sift out, and they can be frustrating because you can find yourself asking questions that you know there's no answer to, and you know the situation's never going to change. But it's like there's two brains. It's like there's the rational brain, and then there's the irrational brain. And that's where these feel like they are coming from, because they aren't rational thoughts. You're never going to find an answer. And but you can't stop asking those questions, and that's actually really hard. Um, our our lives can never be the same after we've lost somebody like that, but we can navigate a new life and create a new life. And when people say to me that they're in the depths of despair and grief, I want to say to them, you will feel joy in your heart again. I don't know when it'll be, and I don't know how long it'll take, but you will. Your loved one, we know they're never going to come back, but you will feel joy in your heart again. You will feel love in your heart again, because it's hard. And, I've lost a husband. I've not lost a child. We will be speaking to people on the podcast who have lost children and hear their perspectives of it. This is just mine. So I would just like to read out a list of common responses to grief. And these responses, there's actually 20 of them. And these are recognised and addressed by various organisations out there and support groups in the UK, and emphasise the importance of acknowledging and validating the diverse range of emotions individuals may experience when they are grieving. So I'm going to read them out for you. So we have number 1, sadness, then anger, guilt, regret, confusion, shock, denial, loneliness, yearning, anxiety, fear, relief, nostalgia, disorientation, physical symptoms such as fatigue, insomnia, loss of appetite or headaches, emotional outbursts, withdrawal, search for a meaning, spiritual questions, and hope. So these just briefly demonstrate how diverse, and I can relate to all of these, not the relief, but I can understand why I have experienced relief from people passing over who have been in a lot of pain. But all the other ones I can totally relate to, going through all of those, and then people sometimes are expecting you to function be able to, cook meals, go to the shops, go to work. In fact, I can remember at one point when not long after my husband had passed, I was sitting in the living room feeling really sorry for myself, feeling really sad. And the light bulb went off on my little table lamp, and it went off, and I started crying. And I could remember thinking, it's going to take us years to change that light bulb. And it's silly because there was a shop across the road. There was, I could easily have got the light bulb and changed it. I was more than capable of it. But it was that overwhelming feeling of everything's just too much and I can't cope. So to get back into the world and do what I know I needed to do, I've always loved writing lists, but I found it really hard to accomplish the things on the list. So what I used to do was, it's just a little funny quirk of mine. I would write down the list of all the jobs that had to be done and then put them in a bag. And then every day I would pick out something that I had to do. And sometimes that would just be too hard and I would have to put it back, but I would get another one out. And things were getting done. I reached out to people. I talked to people. I travelled, which was like a hobby. It was like a dream to be able to travel. And I'm going to be honest here and say, and I'm going to talk about this again in a later podcast because it does deserve its own time to be talked about. I didn't fully come to terms, this is going to sound crazy, with my husband's death for a long time. For a long time, let's just say that. And it wasn't until I had EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization reintegration, I think. And I was fortunate enough to have that. And that changed my life. It changed my life. And up until that point, I'd carried on. I was still in it. Even though I'd married, I'd had children, I still couldn't shake off what had happened. And it wasn't until I had the EMDR therapy, which is really great for PTSD, that I was able to step out of it and to feel joy and love in my life again without that cloud over my head, which was how it had been before. So if you're listening to this and you are struggling with grief, I just want you to know that you are not alone. There are lots of groups out there. There's lots of helplines out there. I'll include them in the information that goes with this podcast. Reach out, talk to people, keep a diary. Do things that make your heart sing, whether that's singing, dancing, but take care of yourself as well. Self-care is so important. It's so easy to not think it's important and not care for ourselves, not try and get enough sleep, not eat good quality food, and not look after ourselves like we are our own best friends. And if you're listening to this because you want to support somebody who is going through grief or something similar, I just thank you. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this, and thank you for trying to understand your friend or your colleague, because it's what we are missing is understanding. And often people have to go through things themselves before they can relate to something somebody else is going through, and that's understandable. But just know that it's so disorientating, it's so confusing, Nothing feels the same. Nothing feels right. Everything feels tainted. And it just takes time to work through that. And sometimes it's enough to just hold on tight. Sometimes that's enough. When you're on that stormy waters and the boat's thrashing all over, you're not going to get great things done when it's like that. And it's about acknowledging that and giving yourself permission with that. It's about acknowledging that and understanding that today is one of those days where just holding on tight is enough. You got out of bed. Wow, what an amazing achievement, because you could have easily stayed in bed for however long. So I'm going to wrap it up there. If you've made it this far, I'm so grateful. Thank you very much for tuning in to my first ever podcast, where I've just started to open up about my life and experience. This is the Navigating Grief After Loss series. We will be exploring other types of grief after loss, or other types of loss. So, grief and loss doesn't just apply to death, or this can be, losing a relationship, losing a home, losing a job, being displaced from your home. All these different things can lead us to experience loss. And again, I'd like to talk about my own life experiences. I chat, I've researched these subjects, and I chat to other people all the time who are going through grief. And I just want to reach out to everybody and say, once again, thank you very much for joining me. Please like, please subscribe, and I'll be back soon. Thank you.